Our conference is also being streamed online, so those of you who couldn't come to us, to the Warsaw Stock Exchange building, can follow us online. You can listen to our streaming service in Polish and in English because we've provided simultaneous interpretation. There's a number of very interesting presentations and panel discussions. Now over to Teresa Czerwińska, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank. Madam, please.
Zapraszam.
Dzień dobry, szanowni państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen,
szanowny panie ministrze,
very good morning to you,
szanowni
Minister,
drodzy.
dear panelists, dear guests. I would like to welcome you to this conference that we've organized together
Inwestycyjnego, czyli
as the EFI and two other organizations, the Ministry for Development and Technology and the Warsaw Stock Exchange.
Jest to już kolejne spotkanie
It's yet another conference in our series. It's called Investment as a Change Accelerator, as a key factor in socioeconomic changes and transformations. I'm very happy that we have found ourselves here in this symbolic place, because of course I hardly have to explain that the stock exchange is a place where capital can be found to fund investment and to fund all sorts of projects. Today, we're going to discuss investment. We're going to discuss the whole process, the barriers. We're going to discuss the stimuli. But I would like to welcome you by saying that today we're facing very difficult circumstances. We are at a very important point for both Europe and Poland. On the one hand, our economy has just begun to rebound after the pandemic. We see some nice positive signs of revival, so to speak, and we can even allow ourselves to be a little bit hopeful and optimistic. But on the other hand, right outside of our border, there is a war going on. Today, the whole world is looking straight at Ukraine. We're looking at the tragedy, the drama unfolding for our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. They're working for their freedom, they're fighting for their freedom, and a lot of them had to flee to safety. The European Investment Bank, the group of the European Investment Bank, from the very first day of the war, has been helping actively all kinds of regions in Ukraine and all kinds of regions and places where Ukrainians flee outside of Ukraine. We know how important it is to support Ukraine financially in this tough war. Right after the war began, we approved 668 million euro package of assistance. And this first assistance package helped the Ukrainian government to fund their most urgent needs. Right now, today, we're also working on another financial package. It's called a solidarity package that amounts to 4 billion euro for the years 2022-23 to help EU member states, their cities, their regions, to support their urgent investment needs around hosting refugees and helping them integrate and fulfill their basic needs. The Russian aggression against Ukraine has led to 6.5 million people being internally displaced, and 4 million people had to flee their country, flee Ukraine. It's a huge challenge. From the point of view of investment as well, we have to think also about rebuilding the free and sovereign Ukraine in the future. We have to start thinking about helping them rebound and get back up after this war. Another result of this Russian invasion on Ukraine is a humanitarian crisis, unimaginable suffering of human beings with an economic dimension to it. Public administration, central government, local governments, they face a lot of challenges. Also, entrepreneurs and the world of business faces a lot of challenges. So we need to talk about competitive advantage and how to build it. A good starting point to start our discussions today is the latest study of the EIB with the participation of over 12,000 businesses, including Polish businesses. Today, you'll be able to get acquainted with the results of this study. Deborah Revoltele, the chief economist of the European Investment Bank, will be presenting these results to you. So let me also point out two important factors before we begin the first panel. Number one is getting funding in uncertain times and assessing sources of capital, sources of funding, and of course, how to structure your investment. It's very important from the point of view of stimulating socioeconomic growth and economic independence. When we're talking about investment, especially private investment, it's a very fragile, but on the other hand, one of the most important links in the whole chain of the economic process. Businesses, if they expect economic benefits in the future, they may postpone consumption and they may start investing into their future. So this particular mechanism, this particular process increases production capacity, creates jobs, and improves the quality of products and services being offered. During the time of pandemic, aggregated demand took a hit. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of negative sentiment among consumers, and the war outside of our border is exacerbating the already existing problem. Around 7 out of 10 businesses in the European Union say that uncertainty makes them postpone their investment decisions. In Poland, 9 out of 10 businesses or entrepreneurs are saying that uncertainty is the very key factor that makes them postpone their investments. For the investment mechanism to work smoothly, we need to have the right way to distribute risk, to provide competitive funding, and of course, consultancy and advisory support. And that's the mission of my bank. Long-term competitive funding, also considering how difficult for SMEs it is to get capital. Only last year, the EIB group gave 6.5 billion euro to support businesses in Europe. 5.7 billion came from the European Investment Bank and over 800 million from the European Investment Fund. And because of this, Poland became, for the first time, it became number 4 outside within the EU 27 when it comes to the size of funding it received, behind France and Spain. Also, funding from the EIB supported around 670,000 jobs, which is 1.2% of the Polish GDP. But also, we need to remember that when we talk about the size of funding, well, the size of funding is also creates a lever. So investing money that helps you get more investors, private investors, public investors. Our studies show that €1 spent by us to fund green projects helps us to activate around 4 additional euros of funding from both the public and the private markets. Today, we know that this year is going to be even more difficult than what we were facing during the pandemic. This year, we're facing challenges that we
zwłaszcza w kontekście
didn't face before
I tutaj
in
grupa
the context of the war in Ukraine.
gdzie to finansowanie
So the EIB group
najwięcej
is focusing on those areas where our funding, our support can bring the most additional added value. So digitalization, human capital,
transformacja.
sustainable energy, green transformation, sustainable urban development and regional development, and of course, support for SMEs.
Szanowni Państwo,
So, ladies and gentlemen,
nie tylko wzrostu,
we need to create not only growth,
wspieranie rozwoju,
we're also
poprawy
helping
jakości życia
develop,
i budowanie
people develop,
niezależności
helping increase
Wojna
quality of
bardzo
life,
jasno
and
pokazała,
build economic independence. The war in Ukraine has shown us that becoming independent from fossil
z punktu widzenia
fuel
strategicznej autonomii.
is important strategically, not only from the point of view of our climate.
Finansowe ramię
So the EIB group, as the financial arm of the European Union for years, has been advocating for the green economy and sustainable
tylko w latach
energy.
2014-2020
Only in the period of 2014-21, the share of loans
i środowiska
related to the sector of climate and environment grew from 25 to 43%. By 2030, we are planning to mobilize more than 1 billion euro to
to jest konkretna pomoc, to jest konkretna
more than 1 trillion euro to support green investment.
budowę
So
odnawialnych źródeł
this is really important. We need to build new energy sources
Dlatego
and new low emissions technological solutions. I'm very happy that in Poland, last year was yet another year
wspierających zieloną transformację.
where green transformation was very strongly represented. Last year, 42% of our portfolio went towards climate and environment-related projects. Renewable sources,
Ponad 1 000 000 euro
the EIB group actually
finansowania.
provided 1 billion euro of funding.
Uzależnienie się od importu
All this brings us closer to becoming independent from importing fossil fuels. It helps us build our energy independence. But we know that apart from energy, another lever,
jest innowacja.
another way to improve quality of life is innovation, new jobs. But I'm talking about jobs that are based on advanced technology, that are going to be less labor intensive, less energy intensive. We need to invest
Większych
in
kwalifikacji,
innovation sectors
płatne miejsca pracy
where jobs are going to be better paid,
na arenie międzynarodowej.
and then our region will become more competitive globally. As you will see today,
Polskich przedsiębiorstw
over half of Polish businesses last year adopted at least one digital technology. That's still not enough when you're looking at a European average, where it's over 60% of businesses.
wciąż za mało.
And if we become even more ambitious, think about businesses in the state. Over 70% of businesses in the state adopt digital technologies every single year. Only 12% of Polish businesses last year planned to invest in innovation.
Zwiększenia
So actually, we can see there is room to become more ambitious, to become more efficient, more productive. And actually, innovation is a way to do this. Innovation is a way to accelerate growth,
aby poprawiać strukturę.
and it's a way to improve
Grupa EBI
our economic structure. The EIB group last year
w obszarze
gave 1.5 billion euro towards innovation and human capital development and digitalization.
niemal 20
It was nearly a 20% growth year on year.
pokazuje,
So again, this goes to show that there is a certain dynamic, there is a certain
bowiem
farsightedness among Polish businesses. Innovation, human capital, these are the very foundation of economic growth.
chciałabym bardzo
To conclude, I would like to thank our partners in Poland,
publicznego, jak i
from the public sector, from the private sector. Thank you for
inwestując, bo
being with us,
tak jak
being on board, because investing together, we build growth and development. We help improve the structure of this economy, and we help
jesteśmy niezwykle
chart new paths for the Polish economy. We're very proud that the EIB group can be part of this huge effort by providing long-term funding. Hopefully, together, we'll stand to do even more to improve the quality of life here, to build competitiveness and an independent, strong Poland within the European Union. I would like to remind you that we will be presenting the results of our study, and then after that, there'll be a discussion panel, hopefully inspired by the study and its results. Thank you so much.
Dziękuję pani profesor za bardzo
Thank you, madam,
wystąpienie.
for this interesting presentation, also a huge inspiration. So now over to our international guest, Deborah Revoltella, Chief Economist at the European Investment Bank, who will be telling us about, who will be sharing with us her outlook on Poland.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to have the opportunity to present the results of our studies on the Polish economy and the situation faced by Polish firms. What I'm presenting is a view that comes from, as Teresa was mentioning, from a survey of European firms and Polish firms. The survey was run during the last summer, so it actually takes into consideration the effect of the COVID pandemic. It doesn't take into consideration yet what are the consequences of the war on the Polish economy. But I think it gives, and I will try to elaborate on that in my presentation, it gives a good basis to reflect what are the vulnerabilities the Polish firms were carrying out following the pandemic, and thinking at what will be the challenge post-war that needs to be addressed. Where do we stand? I will start just looking at where do we stand in terms of aggregate numbers at the European level and at the Polish level. What we see is that the pandemic shock has been recovered quite fast. Actually, this is the success of the policy support that was implemented at the European and at the national level. And what we saw is GDP after the first shock of the pandemic was quickly rebounding than the second shock of the pandemic, but at the end, both the EU and the Polish level, we are back actually to, in Poland, at a pre-trend level in terms of GDP dynamics. That's quite some fast recovery, particularly if we think at the very strong shock faced. And again, it's the results of very fast and very strong policy support implemented. In terms of investment, these two graphs brings the same picture in two different ways. I add what's happening at the European level. At the European level, again, we see very fast rebounds. Investment has been very strongly affected, but after 2 years, we see investment back at the pre-COVID level, and very much thanks to the policy support achieved. In Poland, we see again the shock, we see the rebound, not yet exactly at the pre-pandemic level, but short of. And what we see is mostly on the corporate side, but the heat remaining, but we see recovery starting in the last quarters. So more or less going back, and again with the impact of policy support. When we look at, and here I come to the results of our survey specifically, we look with a number of graphs, what is the perception of firms in terms of the impact of the pandemic, and also the role that the policy support had on a firm per se. And all of these creates a picture to understand How will now the new shock hint into firms? What condition the new shock will find? So first of all, looking at what the firm perceive as an impact of COVID. We had slightly more firms at the European level is some 23%, around 30% of firms in Poland that perceive that the pandemic has an impact in revising down their investment plans. But on the right-hand graph, what you see is something we call it the investment cycle, because you see on the horizontal side the share of firms that are investing, and on the vertical side, the net percentage of those that expect to increase or decrease investment. So if you are above zero, it means more firms think that investment outlook is going to improve. What you see is the whole effect of the crisis. So in 2020, much more firms were negative, so expecting to decrease investment. In reality, you see that the shift from 2020 to 2021 has been on an horizontal line. So the number of firms continuing to invest has remained constant, but now the mood became much more positive from firms becoming, expecting some expansion. This again was COVID time, but was not impacted by the effect of the war. If we look more in detail at the kind of investment, I think what is interesting, and that's quite a nice feature in the policy perspective, is to see at the purpose of investment, what firms are planning to do, are doing in terms of investment. And here there is a big chunk as at the European level where investment is in terms of replacement. But what is interesting is a slightly higher component, both for large and small firms, on investment in new product and processes. That's good because it means that coming out from the pandemic, Polish firms were looking at ways for innovation, transformation. New product and services means this innovation process. This is a good news, but on the other side, more on the negative side, if you want, is the share of firms going for intangible investment. So if you exclude the part of investment that is more tangible, lands or machinery and equipment, the remaining part, it's traditionally much lower at the Polish level. It's something common also with other Central Eastern European economies. But that's, if you want, is a different, it's an area for future focus more on the intangible investment side. Then I switch to looking at what happened with the policy support. And here it's interesting because a big chunk of the recovery from the pandemic on the corporate side was very much also associated to the very prompt policy support. This has been both at the European level and at the Polish level. What we see in the first graph is the share of firms that declare they received the policy support. You see in Poland it's slightly higher than at the European level. And in terms of component, if you look at the kind of instrument used, mostly the Polish firms were more likely to receive subsidies, which at the end is a positive feature in a recovery phase, because you receive the subsidies, you don't have to repay it going forward. Another features that you see is what the firms were doing in terms of their own adjustment on the financing side to compensate for the effect of the pandemic. And here on the balance sheet of the firms. And here what is interesting is some slightly more propensity of Polish firms to also increase, not only the highest share is in increasing debt, and that's kind of, you have a hit on your revenue side, you have to compensate it, and what you do is you find a new form of liquidity, increase in debt. But what you see on the policy side is also some more recapitalization, equity injection coming from existing shareholders, which is something interesting that is emerging from the data. But I was mentioning the policy support, and here in our study at the European level, we look quite carefully with some econometric analysis on how the policy support was distributed to firms and what impact did it have. Here I only report on a graphic point of view what happens at the Polish level, but the story is quite interesting. What we were trying to look at is how the policy support was distributed, and what we find consistently all over Europe is that the policy support was actually going to the firms most in need. How do you define them? The firms that got a need in terms of revenues and profits. So there was not too much allocation toward firms that actually didn't need the policy support. And that's also part of the design of what was happening. In fact, it was a part of the design of the policy support to go to the firms most in need. And then what this policy support allowed was actually for firms to keep investment dynamics. So it was not only keeping firms alive, but it was keeping incentive for firms to continue to invest, which is quite important because the shock arrived in a moment in which firms realized that they had to transform and they had to adapt to a new normal. So continuing to invest and particularly advancing in digitalization was something quite important. So that's what brings us to think that at the European level, but also at the Polish level, we see evidence that the policy support was going in the right direction and having a positive effect on the firms' side. I also look at then what happened to firms in terms of digitalization. And here, starting from the second graph, we show the percentage of firms that tell us that they are using what we call advanced digital technologies. It's not the basic digitalization, it's advanced digital technologies. Here we see somehow a picture of the Polish side. Polish firms are slightly less likely to be advanced digital than the European level, and there is a big gap between the large and the small firms. So that's one element to be considered. But the COVID pandemic had an effect on firm digitalization, and I go back to the first graph. This is somehow different. The message is also basic digitalization, so not only the advanced one, but what we see is that both at the European level and slightly less at the Polish level, the pandemic was actually a reason for firms to become more digital. So starting the digitalization journey. This is more for large firms than for small and medium enterprises. What we also discuss and find at the European level and at the Polish level is actually that what seems to happen is actually that the more digital firms are investing more in digitalization. So the divide among the most advanced and the least advanced firms is actually increasing, which is something to take into consideration in terms of potential challenge for the future. We also look at what the firms think in terms of the effect of the pandemic in the long term. And here, what is interesting is that both at the EU and at the Polish level, firms perceive that the pandemic will have a long-term effect, and most of the firms think that the long-term effect will be an increased use of digital technology. So what I was saying before, the need of advancing digitalization, the concern on the opening a divide, or widening of a divide between the most advanced digital companies and the rest is also reflected in this as a challenge in the fact that the firms themselves think that digitalization will be increasingly important going forward. What we have in Poland is also two other interesting elements: a slightly higher share of firms that both think that COVID will induce a change in their supply chains and also need for more innovation and product transformation. And that's also something that tells you that the firms themselves exiting the pandemic saw that transformation was needed. And that's something quite relevant to have in the picture. On climate change is, I think this is emerging as a big topic also for Polish firms. We have two different questions that we are looking at: whether firms are perceiving the physical risk, be it the real perception of the physical risk related to climate change. And you see that both in terms of perceiving a major impact or a minor impact, Polish firms are relatively well aware that there is a risk related to climate change. But if you think at a different concept, this is the transition risk, so the risk related to the green transition and what it will bring with regulation, changing consumer preference, etc., what you see is the real factor in terms of perception of Polish firms. You have much more than at the European level, firms being aware of this, of the transition risk, if you want. A very strong share saying this is a risk, a small share saying this is an opportunity, and awareness being very strong for large firms and slightly lower for small and medium enterprises. It tells you two things. It tells you that Polish firms are aware that they need to transform, they need to enter into the climate transition and adapt to that. They see it mostly as an opportunity. They don't see the upside yet. Only a small share of firms see the potential upside. And another message is that large firms are much more aware, while small and medium enterprises fail to see still the big transformation needed to take place. Another element is access to finance, and here on access to finance, I think a Polish firm emerges something like traditionally going on. The perception in terms of finance-constrained firms is somehow easing, but Polish firms feel much more finance-constrained than at the European level, and this is particularly true for small and medium-sized enterprises. Another interesting slide that actually we always have is looking at long-term barriers to investment. This is a picture that we consistently have over years on what are the barriers to investment on the institutional point of view in different countries. Here what we see is the biggest impediment for Polish firms, as at the European level, is uncertainty. No doubt we were out of the COVID crisis, so it's really related to uncertainty of the pandemic that is staying there. But then you have a number of other elements that are quite interesting. Availability of skilled staff. That's much more an impediment at the Polish level than at the European level, and true at the European level is also quite an important constraint, and that's quite something relevant in terms of adaptation for the market and the labor market in terms of the kind of skills that are needed. Then energy costs, they were already more constrained at the Polish level than a European level. And then you have other elements related to business regulation, environment, etc., that play a role. But I think the fact that even before the war kicked in, the impact of the war kicks in, uncertainty was a major impediment to investment. The rule of energy cost and availability of skills are important elements to consider in order to assess the future impact. And here comes the last point. This is the environment in which we were starting from. So imagine this is the picture of a recovery phase post-pandemic in which what we found out was having firms that were starting to transform, but still a gap in digitalization, still divergence among firms, the large one more able to adapt, the small one more constrained in adapting, and uncertainty, availability of skills, and energy costs as main impediments. And then the war starts in Ukraine with the tragic consequence that we all well known. The effect on the Polish economy is coming on terms of humanitarian efforts, and also the refugee crisis to which Poland is so well reacting at the European with a very strong contribution, and the effect that the war is having also in terms of spillover at the macroeconomic level. Here I'm not attempting to have our own forecast. I just reflect something coming from the National Bank of Poland in terms of estimate, in terms of lower GDP, high energy prices and inflation. But what I wanted to add is actually a few considerations that we are having in this macro scenario on the impact of the war in terms of consumers, corporates, and public sector. We are doing some analysis, I'm yet not presenting it, but in our own analysis, we see the three transmission channels quite clearly. What we have is a huge additional uncertainty shock that is coming in. Uncertainty strongly affecting the economy, and the new energy shock leading to persistently high inflation for a much longer period. And in this context, you have different shocks coming in. On the consumer side, you have a need on real disposable income of households. Partly will be compensated on the policy point of view, but the compensation on the policy point of view brings back the effect on the public sector finance. But this is a first shock. The second shock that we see is that the corporate sector was coming out from the crisis with a balance sheet effect that were already building in. The new shock on firms coming on the energy price shock side is again increasing the number of firms vulnerable, and if will be compensated by policy measure, again will hit back on the public sector point of view. And then we have the third side on the balance sheet of the government, and then it's the new pressure or new measure to coming to support the economy, and again may have effect on the fiscal side. So we see these three major channels that come in, which threaten at the microeconomic level and at the structural level the dynamics of the economy going forward. Concluding, I think what we see is from our study, we see the effect of the pandemic, the capacity to recover, and the capacity of firms to start to transform. We see the permanent shocks, the permanent gaps still remaining in terms of digitalization. It's advancing, but with some delays and divergence across firms. We see the importance of the climate transition transformation that is perceived by firms, but mostly on the negative side, without being able to catch the positive opportunity of the transformation. And we see the structural barriers to investment that are again related to uncertainty, to availability of skills, and to the energy shocks. And on this coming up, the shock of the war with the consequence on the economy, and it poses challenge in terms of how to address and how to continue to support the economy in this phase without transforming the incentive for the digital and green transition. I hope this brings some element for the further discussion, and I leave it for the panel to comment and to bring a new element. We are extremely interested to learn about this. Just as a reminder, the survey is an annual survey, so I think we are just this week on the field again for interviewing firms, so we will have an opportunity soon to rediscuss the new results with you. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo i zapraszam Państwa na pierwszy z dwóch paneli, który...
Thank you so much. And let us start the first of our two panels. The host will be Artur Osiecki, and it will be about challenges to investors in Poland. Tomasz Robaczyński, a board member of the National Investment Bank, Mr. Skiba, CEO at PKO SA Bank, and Mariusz Gorecki, Secretary of State, Vice Minister at the Ministry of Development and Technology. And we have a guest, Sandrine Crosset, who is joining us online, operating director for the region of Europe and Baltics.
Wydaje mi się, że już chyba nie ma sensu przedstawiać.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Przystąpimy szybko.
Our panelists have already been introduced, so let us just start our discussion. I will ask Mr. Skiba,
Bankowców.
Who represents the banking sector. I mean, all of you, in one way or another, are connected to the banking sector. Okay, we just heard the results of the study by the European Investment Bank, but what about the Polish banking sector? Do we see more investment across our companies in Poland? Well, the report, very, very interesting. The report discussed by the chief economist of the EIB, this was huge inspiration, and we can see a few levels, let's say, or we can draw conclusions at a few levels. Of course, the report and the presentation of the results of the study was all about, in a way, how businesses emerge from the pandemic, how they see the pandemic, how they feel about it, and what makes them willing to invest. And what banks observe is, of course, the result of this decision process. So if a decision is positive, a customer comes to a bank and says, hey, I have a project, I need to invest, and I'm hoping for profits. From the point of view of, well, when we look at the last few years in Poland, you have to remember that in Poland, companies are naturally, and you could see that in the report, naturally they're unwilling or reluctant to take out loans because they are uncertain, they don't know about the results of them taking out a loan and entering into a relationship with a bank. So mostly businesses like to be funded from cash flow. This is what they prefer, rather than go to a bank and ask for a loan. So when you compare what's happening here in Poland compared to the Western Europe, loans or other kinds of debt, less of it than in other countries, definitely in Poland. Because companies prefer to use their own funds, what they have, to fund their investment. They are sort of risk-averse in this respect. This is what happens. I mean, the reasons are what they are, but this is the situation. Right. So this begs the question, is it good, is it bad that they are reluctant? Well, from the point of view of growth, from the point of view of perspectives, of course,
bardziej odważnie.
it would be better for Polish businesses to be more brave, more proactive, taking out loans, investing, sure. It would be better, but, well, it is what it is. Secondly, this pandemic
Ogromną korzyścią dla polskich przedsiębiorstw.
poses a huge opportunity for Polish businesses. What we've seen recently,
Rwące się sieci zależności.
definitely
Czekamy
certain
tygodniami na
chains have been broken. We're waiting for weeks for finished goods, for components from China. Everything has become fragmented, right? So Polish companies started moving, or many companies in the world started moving their production into Europe, into Western Europe. So instead of Asian or Chinese components, they buy components in Czech, in Hungary, in Poland as well, which means demand in Poland, demand for Polish products has grown. And we can see that when we follow exports data, when we follow investment data. So yeah, in 2021, Polish companies felt good and they invested
właśnie z racji,
much more
że przenosi się
because a lot of the supply chains, a lot of the demand shifted from Asia into
polskie małe i średnie
Europe, including Poland. So Polish businesses are benefiting from that and they are more willing to invest. Sure, this is important and I think that this trend will maintain for a few years to come.
regionalizacja.
So the pandemic,
Ta regionalizacja rozumiana jako właśnie zerwanie
well,
z tej dużej zależności geopolitycznej.
there is a something shifted, globalization is not such an important factor anymore. Many companies shift their production capacities into Europe, so this is a huge opportunity for SMEs
elastyczne.
who are flexible, agile, they know how to work with partners, and they're winning here.
To widać
But what about limitations? The report actually indicated some important limitations, but I would like to just say one thing, let's say correct one thing in this report. Because in the report, we see
znaczenie roli
that there is a huge role of uncertainty, that uncertainty is a big factor. We could see that on one of the last slides where there was a question, what was the greatest obstacle to investment?
tam, gdzie był slajd dotyczący
And there was one slide about how
zielona transformacja,
green transformation is perceived.
tak jak
And well,
europejskich 3 razy
in Western Europe,
traktują to jako
companies see
szansę
this
niż
as an opportunity rather than a threat, while in Poland it was like 1-to-1.
to, co jest ważne, żeby
So
powiedzieć.
But
Ja
what's important to say is that
interpretacje, które mnie
the
przekonały,
way I would interpret it
że to
is that
wynika z takiej
it's
percepcji,
it's mostly because of perception rather than facts.
tu jest pewnego rodzaju, tak jak
It's not that,
polskie małe i średnie
well,
przedsiębiorstwa
Polish
mają
SMEs,
pewnego rodzaju
well,
ostrożnościowe
they have a certain attitude, certain perception. They are prudent, they are careful, and they like to, they are guided more by threats rather than opportunities.
tendencja,
It's a certain natural tendency
z takiego
in Poland. Maybe because capitalism hasn't been around for too long, we sort of have a certain perception of risk and threat. So that's a certain filter, a cognitive filter that companies use to look at the reality.
do
Because
inwestowania.
and because of that, they are not as willing to invest, they are not as willing to be aggressive, they're not as willing to take out loans, which of course affects pace of growth. But on the other hand, being so prudent, being so careful also means you're perceived, you're safer. So there are fewer
Ma wszystkie swoje,
bankruptcies, for example.
podsumowując wojnę,
Everything has its own consequences. And of course, the war increases
to, co się dzieje,
the perception of risk, the perception of us being threatened. And of course, this hinders growth, right?
ważnego i niezmiernie
Despite of the fact that
przenoszenie
manufacturing being moved into Europe is a huge opportunity, but on the other hand, threats are on the up. Right, so from what you're saying, Polish entrepreneurs tend to be very careful. So now over to the representative of the European Investment Bank. Madam,
Gdybyśmy mieli porównać
if we were to compare the situation, well, investment, let's say, situation,
pani się zajmuje na
and what's going on in Poland, if you compare it to the Baltics, for example, or the Nordics, because this is what you're dealing with every day, or think about Austria, Germany, and compare Poland to all those countries, are there big differences?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the previous panelist has very well explained already how the situation is in Poland. Now, regarding the SMEs, it is true that Polish SMEs are on the whole more prudent, but the challenges pointed out in the study are also being seen in many of the countries I am responsible for. So this is not only in Poland. What is, of course, a very good thing currently, that Polish SMEs have been so prudent, is that when we see the rise in interest rates, this adds an additional layer of resilience. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, because I had a problem. Thank you. Now, moving to larger corporates, of my personal experience and the experience of my team, that Polish larger corporates have a strategy which becomes increasingly similar to what I see in other parts of Europe. They are also able to tap stock exchange for additional capital. For example, they are ready to issue private placement, so they have a much larger basket of opportunities when it comes to funding their investments. And they have benefited this in the past. Maybe a difference between the different markets is, of course, that in Poland you don't have euro. So this means that the role for international investors might be somehow limited when it comes to being able to provide funding in PLN, in particular for long-term maturities. So here, this is a difference that we see, because in our daily business in Poland, we have a lot of demand for long-term fundings in PLN. And this is something that maybe other international investors can not so easily offer. So on the whole, what I see is that in terms to readiness to invest, yes, in Poland, indeed, we also see that companies tend to be more prudent, with a difference, in our view, between the smaller and the larger ones. Regarding now the specificities of investment, what we have also noted is that indeed we, in terms of what is being financed, we have much more investment relating to industrial capacities and a bit less of investments relating to R&D, which is one of the points where we would like to see a bit more, because, as was also explained previously in the study, to be able to manage all the changes which we currently face, we will have not only to be able to step up maybe local production capacities, and there I think the Polish economy is well placed, but we will have also to be able to design new products, to be able to digitalize the production, and also to be able to find new technologies. So this is where I would then stop, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your remarks, for your remarks and for your comparison of before mentioned countries. I teraz przechodzimy oczywiście tutaj do kolejnego pytania, tym razem.
So now let's move on to the following question, and I have this question to the minister. When we're talking about a state or a government investment policy, should it come up with ready-made tools, instruments, and programs? We have such tools and instruments and programs, or should it just confine itself to creating conducive
Zarówno konkluzja, jak i po prostu doświadczenie.
situation or the conducive environment for companies? Well, our knowledge
regulacji
shows, and well, theorists also indicate, especially given all the circumstances that we're dealing with, namely shocks, and namely a lot of exogenic shocks that we've dealt with, the pandemic, the war. Given all this, we need to combine certain approaches. One approach is to engage very specific programs, to engage public funds, and so on. And the other element in this mix is to initiate some actions in the private sector. The first speaker mentioned it. Like, for example, he said that SMEs are looking for ways to start exporting to some other countries that they didn't export to before. Our economy and our economic growth is, well, one of the drivers of our economic growth is exports. And it's important because during uncertainty, it's a challenge. SMEs find it really difficult to do certain things without support, without institutional support, without investment support. It's very difficult for them to enter certain markets.
But my understanding is that you believe that Polish entrepreneurs should really look at the markets outside the European Union or Europe at large. We know that 80% of our exports goes to the European market and 20% goes elsewhere. And we fully agree that export is a driving force of the Polish economy. So are we going to target African, North American, and Asian markets? Yes, I believe that this is the way to go, especially for the companies that have had links with Ukraine and Russia. Now they have to look for other markets. And another thing that I wanted to mention here, EIB's report and presentation shows that a good combination of the public policy support and engagement of companies brings success. Just look at Poland. We were able to bounce back from the pandemic. In 2021, we had record high growth. GDP growth was exceptional. Okay, you may say that we had a low base to start with, but on the other hand, you had consumer spending and investments, and so it all took off and really picked up. GDP was strong too, and everything was fine until February, this February. And obviously there are challenges, inflation, energy prices, that goes without saying. But this is a certain, exogenous factors that come into play. And now we have another wave of these exogenous factors that will impact the economy, and that requires consistent support for investment. I may flag two instruments here. Polish investment zone and over 70 billion declared investment spending, over 30,000 jobs. And this is a grant program that is going to attract investors, especially in the sector of the high technology. The program will be going until 2026. It will be expanded, and this is additional 10,000 new jobs that were declared as to be created. So there are two instruments, and also Polish Agency of Investment and Trade. So there are some programs for reallocation or for programs that would help identify some niches for the supply chain. And we've heard that Polish companies are able to sort of put their foot in the supply chains. So we have uncertainty and exogenous shock that generates two types of responses. On one hand, we see that there is a high-risk environment, and obviously the risk usually curbs expansion. But on the other hand, we see some shifting. So there is some reshifting, and the new opportunities emerge as a result of these turmoil. The question is to what extent we are able to take advantage of these new opportunities and to what extent we are able to support the companies to pursue such opportunities. Now, two things that I see coming out of the report. First, the Polish companies, when they invest, I believe that they tend to underappreciate intangible assets like IPR. And the reports of the global intellectual property, the World Intellectual Property Organization shows that investment in intangibles help drive profitability. So here we want to come with the legislative facilitation. We want to facilitate the procedure for getting intellectual property rights, to have them protected. And the other thing is investment in digital technologies. And everyone is talking about it. But I can see some barrier here. Namely, the engagement of SMEs, Polish SMEs. They do not sufficiently invest in technologies, innovative technologies. I think that innovation somehow slipped along the way, and we need to find a way to actually put innovation back on track and put in the mainstream of our economic growth. Yeah, I think that that was said during the presentation, but also another thing. And now let me throw you a curveball. Euro as a currency. That's a challenge for investors. I can tell that all the panelists are smiling. So are we all positive and actually favoring our accession to the Eurozone in the long run? In the long run, certainly so. But we need to acknowledge the challenges that are unfolding ahead of us. Obviously, the accession to the Eurozone comes with advantages and disadvantages. I don't want to comment on that because you were one of the co-authors of the report that was published several years ago by the National Bank of Poland. Why not? Let's do it. Let's ask the co-author to speak on that. Well, I think that the arguments that were presented in that report remain true. From the economic point of view, it is still the same. In other words, as long as we are a catching-up economy, we are still a catching-up economy, the Eurozone accession will have limited benefits. But look, we are aspiring to G20, so how come that we are still a catching-up economy? Well, yes, Polish economy is fairly sizable, that's a fact. In terms of GDP per capita, and when you look at the natural interest rates, and when you look at the interest rate differential, and when you see how the fairly low rate of ECB would actually impact our inflation, I think that the main argument is that Poland is in need of the higher interest rates, and the low interest rate maintained by ECB would have negative impact on our economy. So I understand that that was like sort of the heads up on the upcoming interest rate hikes in Poland, right? I've heard that 6% is the target right now. Okay, but let's get back on track and the strategic investment, the program for it.
No tutaj dużo było mówione przede wszystkim.
Well, a lot has been said.
W wszystkich tych wypowiedziach się pojawia
Everyone here
o niepewności.
was talking about uncertainty.
w szczególności od początku 2020 roku.
Well, from the beginning of 2020, we've been living with uncertainty. The entire economy
Przekłada
is operating under very uncertain conditions.
pan prezes
And that certainly
zaburzenia łańcuchu dostaw,
confirms what Mr. Skiba said. So the disruptions of the supply chains, higher interest rates, higher energy prices, all these things combined make entrepreneurs less eager to invest. But on the other hand,
chęć
that also
polityki banków.
reduces the lending propensity of the banks, or banks become more prudent with their lending program. And even if you take the most recent recommendations of KNF, Polish Financial Authority, Financial Services Authority, has come up with the new recommendations on lending.
I skoro mowa jest
So now we see the role for the public sector institutions that are present on the market. And if we are facing uncertainty, we need a public sector institution that would supply certainty to counter the uncertainty. And there are two aspects here.
pan minister,
I agree with the minister.
działa
We do need a mix of the government policy instruments
bardziej komercyjnych,
and
mówiła pani
commercial engagement.
profesor Czerwińska,
Professor Czerwińska mentioned that.
jeśli chodzi o pozyskiwanie taniego
So inexpensive financing and risk sharing. So risk should be shared with the banking system. And I believe that this is the role of BGK Bank, the Bank of the Polish economy. Because let's keep it in mind that this is a bank after all. So one leg of our bank
ramami prawnymi,
is obviously bound by the legal framework, regulatory framework, Polish FSA, in other words, risk. But on the other hand, we have a comfortable situation because our shareholder is very rich. And we do have some regulations that allow us not to race against other banks, but to reach out to entrepreneurs, to give them more certainty, and to pool assets that would help us have a lending program for entrepreneurs. And here is the role of EIB that helps us with the lending program for local governments and SMEs, and the new line that was opened last year for the towns with the population under 100,000 people. And this is for over 700 million zlotys.
staramy się dostarczać
So that's what we are trying to bring to the market.
tańszy,
So this is the less expensive money that we bring to the table.
instytucjami rządowymi oczywiście, bo to jest
And obviously for that we need to work with the government because this is supported by the government.
gwarancja.
And risk sharing, namely
Naszymi sztandarowymi produktami to są gwarancje,
such products
duża paleta
as
gwarancji, które pozwalają
all kinds of bank guarantees that help reduce the risk in the banking sector and induce the lending actions. This is 176 billion in guarantees that were granted.
ponad 550 tysięcy.
And in absolute numbers, in terms of units, it's over 550,000 guarantees that were granted.
No i to jest coś, co pozwala
So that's something that helps entrepreneurs embrace the risk
przez system bankowy.
and also helps banks accept the risk.
Pan minister, jeśli chodzi o
And yourself and the minister, you mentioned the mix, so the combination of the public policy instruments,
ten udział
support instruments, and you remember the slides, the share of subsidies that were granted under various support programs during the pandemic was higher in Poland than in Europe at large. But as a result, Polish economy was able to bounce back fairly quickly.
No, można powiedzieć, tego wsparcia subsydialnego.
And one of the instruments amongst the subsidies is the Strategic Investment Program. This is the program that we started with the support of the Prime Minister's office last year. And this program highlights huge investment needs of local governments. And the purpose of the program is to address such needs. And as we talk to the local governments, we see that some of these needs are very basic. For instance, roads and sewage systems. So this is the recurring topic. And this is important because we talk a lot about digitization, about the advanced digital technologies. Obviously, this is what drives the growth, and that helps foster development and brings profit at the end of the day. But you cannot have more advanced development if you don't bridge the basic gaps. With basic services, so to speak. So these are the areas that we are trying to cover, like road building, sewage systems, and housing needs. Affordable housing for people who can afford to buy a place for themselves. So the housing programs are supported by the Polish government, by EIB, and also our contribution to the risk sharing. There are 150,000 families that are waiting for such affordable housing. So it is hard to launch the rocket into the space if you have such gaps to bridge at the basic level. So the housing program and the strategic investment programs are there to bridge those basic gaps that are still sort of lagging. And so these are the investment tasks with the support of the government, with the support of the BGK Bank as a player on the market and as an actor collaborating with other actors of the banking sector so that we are able to have a cohesive system in place. Well, thank you for this exhaustive reply. So now let's get to the international picture. Minister, is the current international situation with war in Ukraine going on, is it more like a threat to our economic growth, or would you see some opportunities for the Polish economies, also in the context of the investments? Well, if we are talking about the direct impact, then the trade that we had with Eastern neighbors accounted for less than 3% of our GDP. So in terms of geographic exposure, you would think that, we are really bound to trade with Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia. Of course, we import commodities from Russia, energy commodities, but we are actually taking measures to become independent of Russian energy imports. And I think that from that particular perspective, you may say that this is a huge opportunity. We have to make radical decisions, not Poland alone, the EU at large. The decision must be made that we are no longer dependent on energy supply from Russia. Yes, I think that was a sudden acceleration. Well, yes, but we were also able to overcome a certain asymmetry within the European Union. And obviously, this is something that we might have discussed for 30 years to come, but suddenly it is happening as we speak. This is still going on because this is the process that is unfolding as we speak. The sanctions have not been finalized yet, but the decision-making process has been launched in the European Union. So that stimulus was, well, quote-unquote, positive. But there are other problems that we need to address, like import of commodities, so energy commodities, steel. Well, we know that Ukraine was a huge supplier of steel, and now this steel supply is out of the market, you have to find other supplies of steel. That would help us boost the national steel production, but that's not very easy because our cost base is higher compared to that of Ukraine. But we are doing something about it. And now another simple thing, imports of timber from Belarus. That has a huge influence on our economy because our economy has a huge furniture sector. We make a lot of furniture, so not having timber is a main constraint. So what are we doing about it? We are trying to find local supplies in Poland, which is not easy for environmental reasons. On the other hand, we are looking for other import opportunities from beyond the EU. We want to come up with a system that would help us set up the sustainable supply of this raw material. Yes, the industries are actually fearing that everything would come to a standstill because there would be shortage of raw materials. Yes, and this is a very tangible challenge that we are facing. But on the other hand, there is another pathway that is an option here, circular economy. And let's be serious about it. This is a part of a national recovery program. Well, the National Recovery Program is not something that I would be talking about because this is still ongoing, right? Negotiations are going on. And on top of it, yesterday I read on Twitter that Germany and another country managed to sign a partnership agreement for structural funds of 2021-2027, and the National Recovery Program was signed by all the countries except for Poland and Hungary. So Germany is way ahead of us. They signed a new partnership agreement. Now we are still wrestling with recovery program. Well, I just wanted to make it clear that we have to look at the various options here. And again, I was talking about the circular economy. So there are things that need investments, but there are other things that can be fixed with the regulations. For instance, we may change our regulatory approach to raw materials that could be coming from the waste. For instance, today, metal scrap is a very attractive raw material. It has low carbon footprint, therefore somehow it is disappearing from Europe. So we need to address that, and I think that we need to address that with regulation. So this is what we are trying to do. We want to change our approach to recycled materials within the circular economy, and that must be regulated and that must be invested in because technology will be needed to support that. But the companies that are on the market are adapting fairly swiftly. For instance, they are starting to recover wood or timber. They are just responding to what's happening in the market where the commodity prices are going up. So this is just an example how the war and exogenous factors unleash the new decisions, both in terms of economic and regulatory.
So when you were talking about the circular economy, definitely you're right. But also our businesses are known for adapting quickly to tough conditions. So what do you think, sir? What do you think about our perspective, our outlook in the context of the war in Ukraine? Well, hopefully, we all want the war to finish as soon as possible, but it may take a few months or even a little bit longer before it's over. And definitely this crisis has two kinds of perspectives for the European Union. Those countries that are closer to this conflict, like Finland, Poland, Romania, for those countries, this is a time where, fiscal policy is all about increasing spending. On the other hand, you can see the world outside Europe, like Asian investors or US investors, how they look at this. They are wondering, is this geographical area, is this region safe? So from the point of view of perception, This is very important. It's really important to stress that Poland is safe and stable, that the whole region is maybe close to the war, but still very safe from the point of view of investments, especially that we have the presence of Polish and of American and UK soldiers. So this is something that we need to stress. Plus, we're trying to curb inflation. That's important. We're taking active steps to curb inflation, important for stability. And of course, the further west from Ukraine, the less unsafe Europe looks. So within the European Union even, there are different perspectives. Some countries are more engaged, some countries are less engaged, some countries, for some countries, war is #1 priority, for some other countries, not so much, and we hear all kinds of different voices. But of course, for the entire region, for the entire European Union, it is important that Ukraine wins this war. And as a result, if Ukraine wins this war, many problems will be solved, like energy prices, instability, and so on and so on. Right. We in Poland should be also stressing, maybe surprisingly, but we all know that we are EU member states. We are in NATO. We should stress that. I was talking to someone from Canada recently, and he said, what about situation in your country? I said, we are NATO. And this Canadian guy was like, what? Are you in NATO or something? So some investors, some people have no idea. Their knowledge is, or their outlook on Poland is exotic, because he said, are you NATO B or something? And I was wondering, is there a NATO B? So again, people's knowledge may not be so good. So madam, a question to you. What's your outlook and what's your opinion about this situation in Ukraine and about the war and how the war could impact investment in Poland and more broadly in the whole of European Union?
Okay, as was already explained by Vice President Szewinska, EIB, of course, is looking at what is happening in Ukraine very closely, and we are trying to do our best to put forward also programs to help alleviate the consequences on the war, of the war on Europe. But of course, actually, the situation is quite recent. If we maybe all have the impression that this war has been lasting for a long time, actually, the new situation is relatively recent. So it's a bit early to draw the full conclusions of what it means currently or on the longer term for Europe and of course for Poland. I think there are many threats which have been already explained. Of course, the energy prices have increased a lot, and this is now one of the top impediments to investment, as has been also evidenced by the survey, which is actually very revealing in that respect, because the survey was done before the war. So actually, the war, of course, has led to a very important increase in energy prices and in particular in gas prices. But the trend had already started in June of last year. And this was due to maybe more, on the one hand, to short-term factors, and on the other hand, also to more structural factors. Short-term factors, you had in particular the fact that we had a summer without much wind, so the renewable electricity sources were not as high as usual. We had also a relatively cold winter, so the level of the storage capacities was rather low. And then you had also other more structural aspects, like a very high demand in Asia for LNG. So there was less gas available on the market, and also a structural problem, but now that is being addressed at European level, maybe an uneven way of managing strategic reserves of gas across Europe. And now we are tackling this as a community of states, because we have, I think everybody has now understood that stepping up the strategic reserves is key to, let's say, amortize possible shocks. So first, so energy prices, yes, are a consequence now of the war as well, but this aspect was already there. And to some extent to be expected when you also start to shift to a decarbonized economy, because the system is not completed yet. So you still have not enough capacities in terms of renewables on the market. You have still an energy consumption which is very high. So this creates, of course, greater imbalances when you have some unexpected events. And also we still have energy networks which needs to be upgraded and to be also modernized to accommodate new types of productions. So, okay, energy prices, they are going to have a particular impact on Poland, because in Poland the energy prices are rather high compared to European levels. Disruption of supply chain has also been mentioned. There, what has maybe not so be mentioned, in addition to the pure issue of getting the raw materials that you need also on time, you can see that the companies are now facing additional requirements in terms of working capital needs. So because what's happening actually now, they are building buffers, inventory buffers, and of course this costs some money and ties capital which might be not available for investment. So this is an aspect which we see more and more, and of course this might increase also the demand for those goods which are being stored as a buffer, and then create an additional increase in prices. In terms now of opportunities, I think, yes, every crisis is actually a signal that things must change, and we do have opportunities. It's a reason to continue investing also in the transition towards a decarbonized economy, because it's not only good for environment and for climate, but I think now everybody has understood that it is also a key aspect to become more independent from external factors. In terms of Poland in particular, because Poland has been welcoming more than 2.8 million of Ukrainian people. Of course, there you see an additional burden maybe on social system, housing, additional costs, of course, for the state. But there might be also here opportunities, because Poland has been also suffering from a lack of skilled workforce, and has been actually historically successful in integrating the previous wave of displaced persons from Ukraine. So here this might also help the Polish economy to meet certain needs for skilled labor force for its economy, and also maybe for the health sector, where we see actually the health system quite in need of trained staff. Mm-hmm. So it's a mixed picture. Like in every crisis, you might have good things. You have of course less good things, but as we see for the moment, actually, despite all the uncertainties, indeed the economy is investing. So let's hope that the war, of course, will be over quite soon. But what I see is that, at least for the moment, the there is a kind of a balanced picture. So let's, it's up to us now to see, to draw the right conclusions of this crisis and hopefully to emerge stronger when of this particular event, which is rather unfortunate.
Bardzo dziękujemy. Thank you very much. And one additional question is, and tell us please, właściwie to nie wiem, po jakiemu ja tu będę mówić, tak, ale...
I'm not sure which language I should speak. Maybe I will speak Polish and you'll hear interpretation. Right, I have an additional question to you. We've been talking about the energy supplies. We've been talking about coal, hydrocarbons, oil from Russia, and so on. On the other hand, Europe is trying to decarbonize, just like you said, madam. So is there a conflict? Is there a contradiction between investing in environmental protection and investing in energy independence, energy security? So, Madam Cruzet, this question goes to you.
Okay, thank you. I think, of course, it depends on if you are looking at the short term or the long term. We have a short-term crisis now. As I said before, the transition is not completed yet. And therefore, in general, European economies had certain carbonized energy sources as a backup for, let's say, the more volatile energy generation from renewables. And it happens that actually the most frequent backup was gas. And the problem with gas is that more than 40% of European gas supply comes from Russia. It is not so much, there is still an issue on oil, but on oil, the percentage is much lower. And you have also a much wider possibility to get your supply from, whereas the supply from gas is more concentrated on a few actors, at least for the moment. So if you are, of course, a government, you have an urgency, which is to make sure that you need to make sure that the economy is running and that maybe in the next winter, all people will be reasonably warm in their houses. So this is, of course, let's say, this is an urgency, and this might lead to certain measures. We have seen this in Germany, where there are discussions and decisions actually to maybe stop for the moment the closing of additional coal generation capacity. I understand Poland has also informed the Commission also of, while keeping the objectives, that there might be also some delayed closures. You have other states, for example, Estonia was planning to discontinue shale oil very quickly. Now they are stepping up again their production. But this is the short term. And of course, at EIB, we are not looking so much at short term. Our business is really to make sure that on the long term, the right projects are being financed. And there, I don't think that there is a contradiction between decarbonization and of energy and general the economy and strategic matters, because as I explained before, the pillars of the Green Deal are very, very much in favor of increasing the strategic independence of Europe. And I think it has become clear to us now that, for example, if a private person or a company invested in energy efficiency measures 20 months ago or 2 years ago, maybe they did this more because, they were looking at doing something right for the climate than for purely economical reasons. But probably today they are very happy that actually they are not spending so much on energy. So this means that sometimes we tend to focus on what is urgent and we forget maybe what is important. And this is what is for me one of the key messages, is that yes, we have a crisis, and yes, it's important to take short-term measures to alleviate the consequence of this crisis. but we should also not forget about the homework which needs to be done to avoid that we have the next crisis maybe in a couple of years on another topic or on another country. So this is one aspect. And then I wanted also to underline, because you were mentioning environmental protection. I think it's not only about energy supply, it's about energy efficiency. So, of course, the less energy we consume, the more independent we are. And actually, Europe is the continent with the highest investment worldwide in energy efficiency. But if you look at the goals from the Commission, so this Fit for 55, which means reducing the carbon emissions of Europe by 55% until 2030, then Europe will still have to invest more than 100 billion per year to reach that target only in energy efficiency. Then you have also other means. For example, you can, and this was also mentioned previously by the minister, I would like also to say a word on circular economy, because the current conflict has also shown to us not only a disruption in supply chains, but also had started or reinforced a reflection on where do we get our raw material from, and can we become more independent here? And there are two trends that we are starting to see. It's not only a matter of not getting the right materials, there is also potential competition between, for example, materials needed for the defense industry, which might now be very much asked for, and those same materials might be also needed, for example, for renewables or for the industry, let's say the civil industry in general. So when you have materials that you need to import, of course there is a competition, and if in addition to that Russia and Belarus used to be the main providers of those materials, then you are in trouble. Circular economy comes in because, for example, when you look at rare earth, it's easy to say, well, then we need to open up more mines. But the problem with new mines is that it takes a lot of time until they come to production. And also you have limited acceptance from local populations. So it's something that is not an immediate solution. On the other hand, if you look at how we treat our waste for the at present in Europe, just an example, 40% of electronic waste is only recycled. So actually what we are doing, we are buying very expensive resources from outside, we use them, and then we throw them away. So here we really need to step up our capacities for treating waste and recycling, not only for the wood industry, it was previously mentioned, but also for very valuable materials, like, for example, rare earths that you can retrieve from the decommissioning of wind turbines. And then my last point, okay,
last point.
The Green Deal and protecting the environment was also built on shorter supply chains because they were less carbon intensive. And now we all realize that actually, from a strategic point of view, with the bottlenecks that we face and also very lengthy supply chains now, it takes more than 80 days now for a container from China to Europe, then we also have a strategic interest in investing in shorter supply chains. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Proszę Państwa, powoli panowie, musimy się zbliżyć do końca.
Thank you. We need to be wrapping up, but one more question about the private investments, how to support entrepreneurs, and the second question to Mr. Skiba, how banks may contribute to the overall support of the economy.
Bo jednak ta gospodarka
So circular economy, as we've heard, must move forward.
W zasadzie to trochę jest to, co powiedziałem już.
Well, I think that this is in line with what I have already said. The current crisis triggered by the war augments the uncertainty that we've already had.
Czy jakby źródłem tego są
And the source
jest ta niepewność makro.
of the uncertainty is at the macro level.
Redaktor mówił, że czy my jesteśmy w NATO, czy nie jesteśmy w NATO.
Whether we are in NATO or not, it is not clear to the investors. On the way here, I've heard on the radio that the zloty has been depreciating, and the comment was that this is because of the Donbas battle. So the uncertainty is so pervasive and is so strong that each detail news from Ukraine impacts us. So we are in the EU, we are in the NATO, and we think that we are safe, but it is clear that investors may have a different perception of that. So there is a huge role for the government, and I think for all of us, to promote Poland or to change the perception of Poland in the eyes of investors, so that we are no longer being considered as uncertain countries, and eventually we would like to make it and get to the basket, to the stable economies that are anchored in various security and economic organizations at the global level. So in terms of how to support investments or entrepreneurs during the current times, well, during the pandemic, we have already set up the bank guarantee system and the system for the support of the public investment that is done together with the government. We want to continue these efforts. As I've already said, we need to mitigate the risk of uncertainty. And for that matter, we have been working on the guarantee scheme.
Ramy tymczasowe, tak zwane covidowe.
And if COVID EU sort of temporary framework is not prolongated, then we should get smoothly into the crisis framework, and we need to take our products that have been nearly fully utilized, because these programs are notified with the EU, mind you. So the support level is much higher than for the standard products, but we would like to keep it going. And we want to improve that scheme. We want to support liquidity, but in addition to that, we want to support investments with the guarantee schemes, because that temporary crisis framework allows for that. We've had discussions with the Commission about it, and I hope that we should be able to start that in the mid of 2022. In other words, we are going to continue the measures that were taken up during the pandemic, because we continue to ride on the uncertainty wave. What about banks? Well, the banks are with the customers for good and for bad. We've heard that a lot of companies were doing fine during the pandemic, but there were also many firms that suffered because of the lockdown. And at that time, it was our responsibility as a bank to support these companies so that they can survive a difficult time. So it's not only about the financing, but also financing the investments, but also facilitating access to the instruments offered by EIB and to the instruments offered by BJK Bank, so that the overall financing arrangement is the best for the companies. So we wanted to support them also with advisory services, how to access financial instruments that are offered by various institutions. So both the EIB and the BGK Bank. So we want it to be the center of competence, to make sure that we have the financial solutions that are best aligned to the needs of our customers. And as a result, they should be able to pay less for the financing. Thank you. Sanzi Koza, the Director of the Operations Department in the EIB, Leszek Skiba, the President of the PKO SA Bank, and Professor Gładski, the Deputy Minister in the Ministry of Technology, and Mr. Sapociński, the Member of the Management Board of BGK Bank. I would like to thank all the panelists for their contributions.
Witam Państwa po przerwie na konferencji Inwestycje jako akcelerator zmian.
Welcome after the break.
Drugi panel.
And we are going to begin the second panel of our conference, namely how to support private equity initiatives in Poland. And not only the moderator for this panel would be the governor, the president of the Warsaw Stock Exchange, Dr. Marek Dietz. And, well, the panelists are Alan Godard, Director General at the European Investment Fund, Paweł Borys, CEO of the Polish Development Fund, Magdalena Dziewguć, Country Director for Google Cloud Poland, and the founder of ECIO Avia Capital, and Tomasz Poniński, founder and managing partner at Montes Capital.
Thank you, Przemek, for this introduction. Let us switch to English. Many thanks to all of you that you found time today for this discussion. It's our great honor to host so many prominent persons in the venture capital private equity space, but our main guest is Alain Godard, the CEO of EIF, European Investment Fund, which is a driving force behind the European venture capital industry. Alain, if I may, I will start with you. The urban legend in the region here is that on per capita basis, EIF is investing much less in the eastern part of Europe versus the western part of Europe. Please tell us if this urban legend is true. And second part of my question would be, what can be done to acquire more of your EIF investment here, especially in the war situation when Poland is neighboring the country, or Central Eastern European countries are neighboring the country where is the full-blown war. So, Alain, if you can comment on that.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. First of all, I'd like to say that our presence today, EIB and EIF, in Warsaw is a sign of support, not only to the Central Europe and Eastern Europe countries, but more specifically to Poland in this particular moment. So obviously, finance is part of the solution, but it's not obviously, as we know, the only response to the current crisis. Now, coming back to your question, I would say that the EIB and EIF overall, we have to look at things globally. I've been quite present in the recent years and decades here in Poland. If I look at EIF in particular, I think we can be quite happy about the development of the private equity and more recently the venture capital market, for which we are probably not the only player, obviously, but we are an important one. And we would probably talk about that later on, but you see the added value of the presence of EIF in a country is to create, develop a market, specifically in the equity business, not only by injecting money into the system, into the market, but also to catalyze private sector's money. And this is probably the key added value of EIF in this business when it comes to mobilizing private sector money into this specific business. When you look at the activity specifically in Poland and looking at the private equity and VC market, This is a market that has extremely well performed recently. If we look at the figures, and not only, let's say, in terms of performance, but also in terms of volumes. If I look at the latest figures from the VC market, we have actually nearly doubled the amount of investment in 2021 as compared to the previous year. So this is a very good sign that the market is not only developing, but is also maturing. Because normally a market starts, and that has been the case, I mean, in Poland 20 years ago, by more investment into the private equity. The fact that you see nowadays the venture capital increasing a lot is again a good sign of a market that is maturing very much. And there's good reasons for it. I think Deborah earlier explained the macro consideration that are, let's say, supporting such a development in Poland. But there's also micro elements that are very important for Poland market to develop. And I'm thinking about this has been also said in the previous panels, the quality of the education here in Poland is very high. And therefore, this element combined with the entrepreneurship, which we have seen, and there would be a panelist today who will share their experience here. But the combination of the two high-skilled people and this tradition of entrepreneurship, which is growing over the last years, the two are actually a very good sign, again, of a maturing market. Now, to cover your second question, which is more how to deal, let's say, with this specific situation today. And again, I heard, I mean, my previous panelist talking about, let's say, the necessity for Poland to flag the, let's say, the specificities of the country and not to mix up, let's say, Poland with Ukraine situation and so on. I think we are not indeed in that situation, and the fact that again EIB and EIF are today with you is an important sign that Europe is supporting before crisis, during crisis, and after crisis the Polish economy. This means probably using special programs that Europe has been built. We know that the Invest Europe program is going to be operational soon, so there will be a good part of it dedicated to the region, obviously. But there may be also some programs that can be developed with the government, the Polish government. And this is something that, for example, we develop very much with other countries in Europe by partnering with the government in order to deploy, let's say, financial instruments into the country, leveraging on our capacity, not only again to deploy, and we have, let's say, a public institution that do that very well in Poland, but to be able to, again, mobilize the private sector and to come in with us to develop this market, which at the end will not be able to be sustainable only using public money, but also private sector's money. And I'm quite glad to hear from some colleagues today that there would be a few events in May, possibly also in July, in order to announce and federate private sector's investors in order to support, let's say, more these markets going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I counted correctly, you mentioned 3 times the issue of catalyzing private money, and this is a key challenge. Over the last 54 days, I spent quite amount of time on calls, video calls with Warsaw Stock Exchange investors. 60% of our trading volumes almost comes from abroad, and the economists from various banks around the world. And everyone agreed, almost everyone agreed with me that the prospect of the Polish economy are nice. We are far from stagflation and so on, but still they do not see much demand for Polish zloty denominated assets. And pretty soon it can, or already maybe transferred it transferred to the private markets from the public markets, this war-related risk. And my question to Paweł Borys would be as follows. Deborah showed us a presentation, a very nice presentation on and on one slide there was mentioned what are the challenges faced by Polish companies when thinking about investing. And the bar for EU27 and for Poland in regard to the access to finance, the bar for Poland, so the share of companies claiming that this is an issue, was much higher. You, as a CEO of Polish Development Fund and chairman of the Polish Development Bank, how do you see the cooperation with EIF and other institutions in the process of mobilizing private money, both domestic investors and also international investors for the VC private equity space?
Good afternoon. So thank you for having me today. Of course, the venture capital and private equity market was one of our priorities from the beginning of the establishment of Polish Development Fund. We believe that Poland needs complete capital markets. So this is not only the Warsaw Stock Exchange, so public markets, but these are also private markets, which plays very important role because they represent more active side of investment. So they not only provide financing money, but they also provide expertise and support for mostly small and medium Polish enterprises, how to grow and expand. And of course, Polish economy is based on small and medium enterprises, which generate more than 50% of GDP. So especially in Poland, this is very important that this venture capital and private equity market, especially in the segment of growth capital, is very important and plays increasing role in supporting the growth of Polish companies. Unfortunately, as you have indicated, the Polish capital market still is pretty shallow. So especially in Poland, we lack long-term capital, so-called long-term curve, because we don't have well-established pension and insurance companies. So we, as a Polish Development Fund, as you know, not only created the platform, the fund of funds for private equity and venture capital investment, but we also supported the reform of the capital pillar of the pension system. And now we are very close to already have almost 10 billion Polish zloty in new PPK pillar of the pension system. And this could be important element of the whole ecosystem in the future, because if this pension fund would invest only a fraction of their assets, let's say 5%, even today it would be 0.5 billion Polish zloty. So from the perspective of Polish venture and private equity market, it's quite already substantial and it could grow. So I fully agree that at this stage of the development of the market, we need the support of the public institutions, whether they are multinationals as European Investment Fund, or this is Polish Development Fund, or EBRD, because typically we are now the major public institutions which help funds to raise capital. But of course, our priority is that we will mobilize the private capital, the private sector, whether these are business angel or institutional insurance or pension funds. So we hope that now we will build more experienced teams in venture capital and private equity space, which we could scale up and prepare them year by year better to be able to raise private capital in Poland and abroad. And this is especially important now in the time of war, because as you have indicated, our investment story was challenged over the last 2 months, and investors require first higher risk premiums, or also sometimes they are pulling out the capital from the region. So to avoid that we have a financing gap in the market now, the active role of AIF or us would be extremely important, not to create a situation that the funds really faced challenges to raise capital and the financing would be not available in the Polish market. So I could only declare that as a Polish Development Fund, we strongly believe in this model of fund of funds. So we are increasing our activity there. We are increasing our capital deployed. We already have investment in more than 40 venture capital and private equity funds in the course of the last few years, and we would like to continue this activity, but also hoping that within 1 or 2 years we'll again see more and more private equity, private investors active in the market.
That's very promising. Thank you very much. We have a special guest from first, the only female on our panel. There are some people who do not participate in panels when there is no female representative. The second specialty about our guest is that she's from Google, and Google is famous for many things, and one thing is that Google opened quite early an R&D center in Israel when Israel was in war actually with all the neighbors. And how is your view? Before the war you announced heavy investments also in Poland, and how the situation changed after the invasion of Ukraine? You are pulling away or you are investing more? What is your take on that?
Thank you for the invitation. There's always this stress in a panel like this that you're asking yourself if the only reason you've been invited is that you're a woman. Hopefully, I'll be able to prove that there's something more to offer. Well, Google is currently one of the largest investors, private investors in Poland. After our last investment in real estate, probably the biggest American investor in Poland. And for me personally, this is a journey I live. When I started to work for Google almost 8 years ago, we were having a couple of rooms in WFC, one of the most important at that time office buildings in Warsaw. And today we are having offices all around the country, employing huge amount of engineers. And
do you know the number? Because I'm taking notes.
It's thousands. And yes, and also we have very ambitious plans for further investment. And why is it happening? It's not that that Google somehow pulled Poland out on a lucky lottery. This is all data-driven, and I want to bring a couple of those facts. First of all, it's the quality of engineering talent. It's not only Google. Not many people are aware that majority of European tech companies are actually developing their software in Poland, whether it's Ocado or it's Minto. where it's Opera, their R&D and engineering centers are based in different towns across Poland. This is a second important fact that is not known to wide public, that it's not about Warsaw. Many cities, many countries in the region are based around one city as a tech hub, whether it's Berlin for Germany or Prague for Czech Republic. Actually, it's unique about Poland that we have huge tech center in Krakow, huge tech center in Wrocław, huge tech center in Gdańsk, huge tech center in Rzeszów, in Szczecin, and Warsaw is just one of them, which actually gives access to a big diversity of engineering talent close to the industry. What I often hear is that we're not only having a good access to software engineers, but also they are close to the real problems. Poland has currently one of the most modern agriculture in Europe. And actually with the current war crisis, the food is becoming a really important issue. And if you're looking what happened in last 10 years in Poland, actually we're becoming the main producer of food for the rest of Europe with a very modern production sites. Same happening in industry, where we were just discussing before this panel. If you ask a random investor in Paris or London, where are the most modern factories being built? Well, probably Poland is one of those places where in the last 10 years, many modern factories were being built, also with the offshoring process, because it's close and it still provides a good access to lower costs of labor. And with the logistic investments of the last 15 years, actually within 1,000 kilometers from Poland, you can actually access majority of European consumers within 24 hours. That puts Poland as a very interesting place for variety of investments, not only in the tech area where Google is investing, but Google is also investing in real estate here, expecting that we're going to see a further growth in many industries. And also in the service area, we are moving a couple of our global services to be offered from Poland.
So very optimistic. Google stays. I have to tell the investors who are shorting Polish assets that they might doing a wrong bet. Marcin, if I may move to you. You are running a growth stage fund. And if I was informed correctly, you have among your investors both EIF and PFR Ventures. You've heard a lot from Alain and Paweł about mobilizing capital, supporting venture space. How it is from your perspective, if you are thinking about fundraising, new funds and so on, do you believe that under this war situation you can still raise funds in Poland outside of the soft money, but with the private investors? And what type of aid from the soft money providers would you expect in this process of raising funding from international investors?
Thank you. I think even before the war started, it was a huge problem to fundraise small funds without EIF, EBRD, and PFR. It was very difficult in Poland. And why is that? I think it's very easy to understand once you look at how similar funds fundraise in Germany. They have a lot of local fund of funds, foundations that can help fundraise. So even before the war, it was very difficult to fundraise without these three fundamental pillars of this process. And everybody's thankful to EIF, EBRD, and PFR for basically making it possible to fundraise a fund, especially smaller ones. The big funds, like the mega big funds and the big European funds, you can probably fundraise without help of these three, but even the smaller ones, like below 200, 300 million funds, in euros, it's very difficult to fundraise, even before the war. Now, during the war, I still remember the 98 Russian crisis. I started at private equity back then. We fundraised just before the crisis, in June, I think. And then for the next 2 or 3 years, it was impossible to fundraise in Europe. And it was just a crisis. It wasn't a war. It was just an economic crisis in Russia, which Poland was, hit by this crisis or impacted, but it wasn't a war. So yes, I think it will make fundraising even more difficult. Okay, and we hope that EIF and EBRD and PFR will help more during the next 2-3 years. So we need time for everything to cool down and the war to finish. And we also believe that we need more vehicles, fund of funds, to be created. Because there is a trick about fundraising, that you need 2, 3, 4 investors to be able to build a fund. 1 or 2 is not enough, because normally there are some percentage limits in fundraising. So if the local investment base dries up, the independent local investors, if they more cautious because of the war, then we'll need more vehicles. Not even technically more money, but more vehicles to be able to close the fund. So I think among in our industry, we do believe that we'll need more help and probably more vehicles to be able to invest in GPs in the next 2-3 years, for as long as this big issue that we have on the eastern border resolves. So that's what we think it's needed, and but we're very optimistic. Yeah, we agree that Poland is on a great path. We think that the industry is developing in a very nice way. I think there are more than 120 VC funds that are working. Most of them were invested by PFR. It was a lot of work from PFR for the last 5 years or more. And I think the industry is developing in a very good direction. And I absolutely agree that Polish IT sector, robotics, material science is developing in fantastic ways. And Poland will become, within the next 5-10 years, also a tech hub in many industries, because this is on the right path.
Thank you very much, Marcin. How do you know, Tomek, that I'm going to ask you now? Okay, yeah, so it will be your turn, don't worry. You are working, you are one of the most active PFR Ventures portfolio funds with a lot of investment, but you work in a quite challenging model, I think, because it's deal-based. So for every deal you have to, except of PFR money, you have to raise the private money. So you have to work on both ends, deal and fundraising. In the recent month, you talked to many companies, I presume. How the attitude to investors changed? Is Polish companies realize some shortages of equity? They are becoming more ready to accept your terms, your valuations, or the behavior did not change by the war? If you can elaborate on the issue related to your targets.
Well, in this moment, there is still no change. To be honest, talking with the targets and talking about the valuation and the situation in the market, they agree that there is some problem. That could be some problem, but it's still they are not ready to discuss about the valuation. From another point of view, I will say many of the targets or many of the processes we started and we suspend or we were just observed, they are becoming they are slower. Generally speaking, it's much more difficult for the targets to gain investors, to gain money. But in the same time, they are still not open to discuss about the valuation. I will add one thing, one point also to what Marcin said before, because about the looking for the investors and because as you said, as you mentioned, we are working in this open structure, meaning each deal we have to find investors for our investments. And it's not and the war changed a lot. Meaning the investors from the Europe, we've got some private investors from Europe. They all suspend decisions of the investments because of the war, because of the situation. Let's say they are not directly saying that it's before the war, but because of the situation, generally speaking. But from another point of view, what is very important, when we talked with many investors on the West, in Western Europe, they are asking us, okay, you've got the PFR as a qualified investor, and we understand that this is kind of quality check for you as a fund, but from this investor's point of view, meaning some family offices and so on, they are asking, okay, but in our investment policies you need to have extra quality check, meaning EIF as an investor. They are saying you do, about us that we are doing a great job. Our let's say investments are very good and everything is okay. But from their point of view, they are expecting some, let's say, European quality check, except the local one. Even not because they are not, because they are thinking, they're saying, okay, PFR, they've got the same quality and the same expectation, but in many of the many family offices, they've got just in the investment policies, in investment strategies, saying that the target, I mean the funds, needs to have also the EIF or similar to EIF European, I mean EBRD, because it's nothing else, being the second investor or third investor. But so it's so important. I agree with Marcin. It is so important to create more fund of funds powered by EIF. What will give the Polish funds chance finding private investors not only from Poland but also from Western Europe, because we have to remember that because of the mature of the market in Western Europe, the investors are more they agreed for that they are gives us possibility to gain more to create bigger funds, and what this is very important because of the in the situation when the targets are very interesting and we've got the competitive situation with the funds from abroad, and we are not, and we've got a lot of problem to be competitive because of our size, because of our power to invest and follow-ons in the future, because they are saying, okay, but your size and your chance to gain more private investors are limited because you are from Poland and you've got only Polish sources, which are limited.
Thank you very much. I mean, Alain, you, Marcin first, and Alain.
Brief comment to your question. yes, unfortunately, we see some slowdown in activity of European venture funds. Because on 3 deals that we were working on 2, we know for a fact that the Western VC said, no, we cannot do it today. And on the 3rd one, we think it happened because the deals are much warmer, they're progressing much faster. So on 3 deals, we know for a fact that the global VC said, sorry guys, we cannot do the deal now. Okay, so we see some impact on the environment. It's just a slowdown right now, nothing serious. But yes, I think we see it already.
Alain, would you like to comment before I ask you a question?
Thank you. No, I think this is an interesting debate, and also it's good to have input which we collect indeed in each of our trip here in Poland. So this is consistent with what we heard before. I think what we can gain from the market is the feedback that the market may be impacted, and clearly you gave very concrete examples. At the same time, we don't hear, let's say, the more roaring message that the market may, let's say, be deeply impacted by the crisis. I think it's, I would say, expected, if not normal, but expected, I mean, to see some turbulences at the moment. We don't know yet about how the situation will evolve. And this is de facto a message that investors don't like in general. So they are prudent. And in what I heard from you, I think it's maybe more a question of delaying, let's say, certain investment rather than, stopping investing in the country. We are expecting possibly, like it happened, I mean, in the past, maybe more selectivity in the investment and investors' behavior. So, in other words, they may look for, let's say, the best opportunities or underlying assets. So that is something that we could expect clearly. Now, what can be done, I mean, to make sure that we overcome, I mean, such an issue? I mean, first of all, is to increase our presence. So this has been mentioned several times, and we are very conscious about the impact that we can have here in the Polish economy. Second, we are here in the temple of the stock exchange, where you know how important are data. It's critical, and it has also been said, thank you for mentioning that again. Therefore, for me, another important development we need to work on is to make, let's say, the data on the investment more transparent to the public and to the investors in particular. We have, for example, a project, I mean, inside EIF to partner with a certain number of public, but not only public and private institutions, in order to share data. So that we are able to pool them in order to reassure, and we should not be shy about the performance that you have been achieving over the last years. They are very good. You have, as we said before, I mean, the fundamentals of the Polish economy is strong. So I think we may face indeed for certain weeks and months going forward still some uncertainties and prudence from investors. At the same time, and that's why I was referring before to events that will be organized here, we should be able to communicate better, communicate also from fact, data, on the performance that are here done in the market, and therefore continue to spread the reassurance on the market to investors that the fundamentals are still very good here. Again, I'm not saying that there will not be any impact. I mean, this will be obviously wrong, but I think we can mitigate to some extent a certain number of messages or extra prudence of some investors.
Thank you very much. You actually answered my one question prepared, so I will ask you another question, ad hoc question. Both Marcin and Tomasz, they asked for more EIF-supported fund of funds. I remember you had one program for fund of funds, but none of the Polish institutions received funding as a fund of fund. But are you going to work also on supporting fund of funds initiatives?
Okay, first of all, and this is an important message indeed. We are, okay, EIF is a fund of fund by definition, but we also manage fund of fund on behalf of member states, regions, and so on. And that's why I mentioned earlier, let's say, our capacity to offer, in a way, a service to member states or regions in this field. Our expertise is available indeed for that. And I was thinking about a few fund of fund that we have built specifically in the Central and Eastern Europe already. We are in talks actually with some of these countries in order to either top up, I mean, this fund of funds, or to create new ones. I think you mentioned also the important segment, and I know you want to come in also with this issue of scaling up, certain companies in Poland, which is quite a natural stage at the moment. I mean, the market has grown up over the last the decades, and we see more and more, and this is very consistent with what we observe in other countries in Europe, companies growing, sometimes very fast, and you have celebrated your first unicorn here in the country. More will come, for sure, and you need to be there in order to accompany these startups in their scale-up phase. And you mentioned, the lack of funding available in Europe, and that's why we know that a lot of these funding rounds have been, let's say, supported by US funds in particular, but also Asian funds. So we want, and you probably heard about this initiative called precisely Scale Up Europe. We want, I mean, to partner with a certain number of countries in Europe. Some of them have been already very active in order to support this initiative of creating a 10 billion fund of fund managed by EIF, which will be specifically focusing on these growing companies or startup that needs obviously financing from abroad, and again, investment from Google or other investment funds are very welcome, I mean, in Europe. But it's also equally important that Europe is able to support, I mean, these European companies in their growing stage. And this is where, I mean, this initiative called Scale Up Europe will help a lot.
So one clarification question, but do you also consider support for private investors, like family offices, in setting up private money-based fund of funds?
We are actually offering already today for years, again, capacity, I mean, to set up and manage fund on behalf of corporates, family offices. This is a program that have been built some years ago. We have already some, for example, pension funds. who are giving us, I mean, some money to invest. But not only, more and more big corporate companies in Europe who are, let's say, investing through fund of funds, not only to get, let's say, additional return, but also to get diversification and access to innovation. And we know that these big companies, they have their own center of research, but they see to some extent the limit of their own center of research, because they see more and more innovation coming through startups. So they want to be there as well. They want to, to be able to gain, and sometimes even to buy, or co-invest directly into these startups. So this is also available, indeed an available tool that is very useful in order to federate and to mobilize private sector, bringing the unique expertise of our fund of fund, let's say, structure.
You wanted, to chip in.
Yes, I wanted...
It's the dream situation of a moderator when people want to speak by themselves. So I should not limit you to.
I wanted to take good use of the fact that I got a seat in this panel, because just to summarize the discussion, it's really not difficult to invest in good deals. There will always be people ready to finance good deals, even with the higher risks, if there is a good deal. But I do believe that both TBI and PFR are not only here to do good deals. They are investing with a mission and to fund the growth. And I wanted to pay your attention to two areas, which especially now in a crisis, require a dedicated focus and looking forward. I think the first one is the energy sector. Entire Europe needs bold, innovative agenda when it comes to energy. And I think Poland is big enough, small enough to pilot a lot of innovative experimentation when it comes to energy diversification, both in production and distribution and everything related to monitoring, intelligent consumption. And it requires long-term investments. None of these projects will come up in a couple of months of ROI. Second area, which is also a result of the crisis, is actually activating women as a labor force. With millions of Ukrainian women coming here with kids, we need dedicated programs for upskilling, for creating new type of entrepreneurship opportunities for them, but also to convert many of those jobs to hybrid work, to tech jobs. It's possible, but it also requires a dedicated focus and investment. And it would be great if, as a result of this panel, we could take a look at those opportunities. And these two areas are very close to Google, and Google is also ready to partner in such initiatives.
That's really an issue, what you've just said. I mean, 90% of war refugees coming from Ukraine to Poland are women and kids. Yeah, so that's a really challenge, and of course, energy thing gets high priority. But if I may, Paweł, refer to you with a slightly different question. It seems like there's an asymmetry of information, because on the one hand, all the panelists are confident about Polish economy, about venture capital industry and talent pool, innovation capacity. But on the other hand, funds strive to raise private money. So the question is if there can be an initiative of PFR supporting funds in fundraising, in attracting more private investors. Like Google is an insider and is very positive on Poland. Why the financial investors are hesitating to pour more money into VC, Polish VC space?
So first of all, I'm not surprised that investors behave like this, because they are emotional and typically they very much simplify things. So if you are an investor in US and you see the war in Ukraine, and they are asking whether some bombs are not visible also in Poland. So for them it's the one region, and unfortunately we see some capital outflow from the region. So what Poland needs to do now, and this is critically important, to show and prove that we are okay, pretty close, but we are in the European Union, we are at NATO, we have very strong fundamentals. Actually, we are in the heart of Europe. So our investment story should be still perceived as a developed and resilient country. So with different institutions and of course government, we put now a lot of attention to promote the economy. Actually, 2 weeks ago, I have met Sundar Pichai, so the CEO of Alphabet. He was visiting Poland, and we also had the opportunity to speak about maybe attracting some new investment of Alphabet, even the venture capital fund to Poland. So we could do this type of activity to attract investors. It won't be easy in the short period of time. So still, as a public institutions, again, we need to bridge the gap, because there will be some financing gap for 1-2 years, we don't know. But as together with IIF and other public institutions, we need to bridge the gap. Regarding our investment strategy, typically we focus on 2 dimensions. One was so-called competitiveness, so broadly speaking, new technologies and how to scale up the companies. And the second priority was energy transformation, so we created PFR Green Hub, and for the last almost 3 years, we invest in funds which focus on sustainable financing and energy transformation. However, in the last 2 months, we have added to these priorities also so-called resilience. So what we now see, that because of the war, deglobalization, pandemic, there is a huge problem in supply chains. So there is supply shock. And what we do, we analyze the different sectors of the economy, and we are looking for some missing pieces that from the economic security perspective are critically important. And what we will do also in our fund-to-fund activity, we'll try to promote investment in some specific areas which are important to increase the security of the economy, to make the supply chains more efficient, because I believe now that this is the biggest challenge from the economic perspective. Unfortunately, the world has changed, and the investment decisions will not be driven mostly by, costs, where it is cheapest way to produce something, but now it will be driven after pandemic, and because of the war, they will be driven by security reasons. Yeah? So we would like to also attract capital investment using this trend of nearshoring, and I believe that Poland could play an important role in this respect.
Thank you very much. The last issue is also on my list, but before we move to this question of security, brief account, what Google can do, Alphabet can do to evangelize American, US investors to come to Poland?
I think we already do a lot, just being a role model, and it usually helps. We've invested in the new tech headquarters here in Warsaw after the war started, and we didn't pull out from this investment. We made a lot of announcements also globally about this investment. We'll continue investing, as I said earlier, because this is a very good place to be. And Poland is becoming a tech exporter for Western Europe. Those services are being offered by many companies, not only by Google. It's becoming a place to develop software for global markets, not only for European markets. There are a couple of limitations which we need to work on to be able to scale further, but with high quality of education, I do believe it's possible. So we'll continue investing, we'll be talking about it, and also with the recent visit of Sundar here in Poland, I think we send this message very clearly. We have a region, a cloud region in Poland, which is the only one in Central Eastern Europe. It was built here even before there are similar investments in France or Spain, because of a maturity of tech ecosystem here in Poland. This infrastructure is necessary. We have our R&D center, the main one in Europe. We have now number of offices that we own, not only rent. I think it all comes together to a very serious presence here in Poland, which will only grow in the next years.
Okay, so Google is a kind of show window for Polish economy. And last round of questions, we don't have that much time, starting from Marcin and Tomasz. The standard provision in many LPAs for venture fund, private equity fund, was exclusion of industries like military production, armor, and so on. With the peaking global spending on armor and other defense and offensive stuff, how do you see the perspective of investment in the dual use cases or in purely weapon production? This is the future for the venture capital, or still this industry will be out of scope of, for venture funds? Marcin, if you can start.
The dual use should not be such a problem, because it's all from construction to vehicles to IT, cybersecurity, new materials. So this should not be a problem. So this is, I think this is already happening, yeah? Or was happening for some time. Now the military use, I think this is a very tricky thing, very tricky issue for a couple of reasons. A, normally in a big fund you have investors from a lot of geographies. So we, in one of the old funds, we had the Middle East as investors. So they had different policies on a lot of things from the European and American investors. So the military, pure military use companies, so focused on military equipment, this will be a very tricky issue for a very long time, we think. And that's one. The second is a regulatory issue. To have access to military companies, you need to do a lot of paperwork. So for normal GPs, that'll be close to impossible to run pure military investments because of all the certificates that you would need to have to run due diligence, for instance. So I think this will be very difficult, but yes, with growing share of the GDP invested in military equipment, I think there will be new funds that will be focusing on mixed use and pure military. I think so, yes. Unfortunately, in many ways, because I think we all would prefer that all this R&D goes to new energy and low emission cars and flying to the moon even, instead of going to the armament industry.
In the early stage investing, how do you see it, Tomasz?
Yeah, I will add something here, because I think that there is that this dual-use investments and projects that they are already, as Martin said, they are already financing by VC and by PE and VC, and I think it's becoming more and more important from the also military point of view, because we are, as we can say, the pure military production based on, for example, semiconductors, which are completely not pure military. In the situation with the globalization, which Paweł Borys mentioned, the globalization, showing that Europe, the policy of Europe, to be more independent and to be more, let's say, having secured by themselves in many areas, create the great opportunity for the VCs in the area of also this secure, let's say, sector, not pure military, but in general the defense sector.
Thank you very much. Yesterday I visited the CEO of WB Electronics, your portfolio company, Paweł. Do you think you're gonna invest more in the armor space? For you alone, they do drones and this kind of electronic things for army. What is your take as a PFR?
Yes, so WB Electronics provide very up-to-date software for the army, but also drones, which actually they are fighting now in Ukraine. I cannot say too much on that, but I can say that I didn't think 4 years ago when we invested in WB Electronics that it would be so strategic investment for our fund, and so for sure we would like to support them from the capital perspective to make sure that they have proper resources now to grow. Of course, financing this type of activity is very tricky. So it's very difficult to obtain financing in the banking sector for obvious reasons and in different institutions. But we as a Polish Development Fund investment in WB Electronics because we perceive that this industry is also a very good provider of new technologies, which could have the dual use, and this is very visible in many countries. So for sure, we would be still interested to invest in this area, maybe especially now.
Okay. We're looking forward to that. WB Electronics is also an issuer of bonds on our market, so we keep finger crossed for them in many ways. Alain, it's not that often that CEO of EIF is visiting us, so we demand more from you in this panel than from the other panelists. And my question would be, how we see your view on, first of all, on the VC industry and the dual use and military technologies, and second, what is EIF role in the European security and military innovation space? What are your plans here?
I would not have much, let's say, to add frankly to what has been said. I see the existing environment, let's say, compatible with our principles, and when investing into dual technologies, I mean, this is something that is frankly compatible so far. Investors also are perfectly fine with it. Now, if we are really talking about investing into defense technology purely, I think it would have to be done indeed through pure public, let's say, investment channels. It would not surprise you if I tell you that obviously within Europe, And at the moment, there's discussions on how to support, let's say, investment into defense. The role of our public institutions could be solicited at one point. Also, it may be more difficult for the bank, European Investment Bank, in the sense that obviously they borrow money from the market, and therefore it would be very difficult to accommodate for such investment. For EIF, it could be, let's say, maybe less problematic, but nevertheless, it's quite a big, let's say, step. And therefore, I don't see, let's say, in the immediate future, let's say, EIF investing into such industry. Also difficult to predict what will happen, I'm afraid, in the near future. I think what we can say today is that investment into defense will not be a taboo anymore. I think in Europe, for many countries, specifically in this region, and therefore I think let's see what comes next in the context of Europe, and probably beyond that in the context of NATO.
So you do not expect fund of funds focused on just security and defense sponsored by EIF and a huge wave of venture capitalists coming into this space. You rather expect simply the public spending more on military, so more like a French model.
I made the difference, security versus, let's say, weapons, or obviously. Security, I think I see it already today, so and therefore that I would not exclude.
Okay, so security, yes, economic and other technical security, but no the defense. Okay, so I would like, I had one round of questions, which is very brief, and really be brief. I would like to ask the panelists, off top of your head, it was not prepared before, they are also surprised by these questions. Do you expect that Poland will have 50 unicorns within 5 years from our panel now? And yes or no, what is your take within 5 years? Maybe starting from Tomasz, to give other time to think.
Okay, 50 unicorns in 5 years? Well, to be honest, I'm not so optimistic. But from another point of view, I think that in Poland, the whole ecosystem will be much more mature within these 5 years. So it gives us possibility to have 50 unicorns in 10 years.
Okay, 50 in 10 years. Who gives more?
Depending what the unicorn is, really. But
billion-dollar
probably
valuation.
50 companies with European important role in the European economy, like top 3 in some areas, probably yes. But not unicorns like
not billion
valuation, but with a vital role in niches of economy, I think probably yes.
View from Google. How many IT unicorns?
Looking at around 1 million Polish people under 13 that are currently hired by international shared services, tech centers, R&Ds, speaking great English, learning on a global scale. I think Poland has everything it needs with this hunger for success, which is still an important factor to be there with all those unicorns. If Poland will take the opportunity to accelerate that growth, depends on many things that we have limited impact. But I do believe that the situation of Poland, even with the Eastern war crisis right now, is unique. And in Ukraine and Poland will be able to join forces in the next couple of years. I think it will be new energy of growth for the entire Europe.
you are investors like 70% of all venture funds in Poland. So do you expect from your portfolio to have this 50 unicorns?
So I believe yes, if you change dollars to zloty.
Okay.
So I think this
So 250
realistic. Yes.
So you expect 50 companies of value of 250?
I can imagine this.
Yeah, you can imagine. Allow.
The question is whether 5 years ago you would have expected to have one unicorn.
Well, and actually there are more from Poland unicorns than just one, but indeed it is tremendous that Polish VC market was flat and then started to double every year. So nobody expected that. With all respect to PFR, but even you, I don't think you were so optimistic about this size of the investment, especially global funds coming to Poland and investing in Polish companies. So that's why 5 years is not that much. It's an investment period of a fund, usually. But still, that's why I asked about this 50, because something was not unexpected has just happened, like we have on our venue tech companies with the valuation of a few billion euros. Yeah. So, and from your perspective, your international perspective, your pan-European perspective, do you think the upcoming 5 years could be the game changer for the Polish or Central Eastern European economy?
I think it will. I will not obviously comment on the number today, but it will be. And indeed, you reminded us, let's say, the exponential growth in this market. So at the end of the day, it's a question of giving the signal to young entrepreneurs, new generation, that they can do it. And if this is the case, therefore you can expect many of them to come, and not only in Poland but across Europe. And that, to me, in what I've seen across Europe, is a big game changer as compared to the past, is the capacity for anyone in any country to raise a fund and to become, in a way, unicorn, in the future. So I think this is a very positive message that we should give to the young entrepreneurs, which I don't see many here in this room today, but I'm sure a lot will follow up.
For them, the stock exchange is an old-fashioned building, and they never come here, so don't worry. Only they visit us once when they have IPO, then they disappear somehow. I don't know why it is. Dear audience, and all of here in this venue, in this room, and also our audience in front of your screens, thank you very much for listening and watching us today. It was a content full panel. Thank you to the panelists. I think they deserve an applause. My name is Marek Dietl, and on behalf of Warsaw Stock Exchange, I would like to thank you for joining us today, and this optimistic message. It's still doable to have quite a few unicorns within 5 years. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję Państwu. Nasza konferencja powoli dobiega już końca.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our conference is about to close. Right now, we are going to have the last presentation. Professor Mariusz Kolecki, the Secretary of State and the Deputy Minister in the Ministry of Development and Technology. Professor, would you please wrap up and formally close this conference?
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank our organizers, the Warsaw Stock Exchange and the European Investment Bank, who proposed and presented and initiated the entire discussion, because of the report on the investments in 2023 and the recovery being the catalyst of changes. And I think that both panels were sort of evolving around this messages from this report. And I would like to thank the panelists. I believe that they shared very interesting views. We've seen the perspective of the public sector institutions, so it was more at the macro and geopolitical level. But we see that the panelists sitting on the second panel were actually sharing the same opinions. So we are all concerned about security, dual-purpose technologies, and putting it bluntly, the development of the military technologies that would support our security. And if I were to comment on the report, EIB report, showing the data and referring to 2022, but focusing on the pandemic, so focusing on the past year data. The report showed how Europe was able to go unscathed through the pandemic. And at the same time, it was clear from the report that the response of the public sector and private sector institutions was very important for the economy, and it is really hard to say that everything was absolutely clear. So there was some asymmetry, I should say. There were countries or there were sectors where pandemic and the huge support instruments and private capital that sort of followed in last year help foster recovery. But at the same time, we've seen the sectors where the trend didn't pick up. And February events, namely war in Ukraine, might have contributed to this trend. Well, look at tourism. The entire CEE region will struggle with tourism because of the war. One of the conclusions from the report and this presentation that we've heard from EIB and this is specifically about the Polish economy and how it responded to the COVID-induced challenges. Well, I think that there is one thing that we all agree, that Polish economy has strong foundations. So in terms of the structure and the fundamentals of the Polish economy, it is strong, but it doesn't mean that we don't have our own challenges to embrace. So what are the challenges of the supply of skilled workforce? This is not the problem of Poland. This is a shared problem across Europe. So we need to invest in human capital. And we talked about it during the second panel. We have skilled people. We have people who are eager to learn and who are able to learn, but we need to be more proactive about it. And the second thing is costs of energy. We've heard a lot about the energy transition and green energy, but we've also talked about certain autonomy and diversification. We spoke about eliminating energy commodities exported by Russia. So in this context, energy transformation becomes a priority and it accelerates various processes, not only political processes, but also economic processes. So we talked about how to diversify supplies of oil and gas and electricity and how to effectively manage energy. In other words, we need to look at the investment projects that would help us become more energy efficient as the economy. And this is important in the context of commodities. And we were talking about the circular economy. And the third challenge that was diagnosed and I think that everyone is in agreement about it, is uncertainty. I may say that the uncertainty is also well visible to the Ministry of Development and Technology.
Jeżeli patrzymy na inwestycje,
When we look
w szczególności bezpośrednie inwestycje zagraniczne w Polsce,
FDIs in Poland, last year we had a record high number, 27 or nearly 28 billion euros were invested by foreign investors in Poland. What's going to happen this year? We don't know, because there are challenges, and we talked about them at great length. In other words, how the region is being perceived by the private sector investors. And again, back to uncertainty. Now, how to contain or mitigate the risk? I believe that Mr. Boris said that PRF, but also other public sector investors are there to bridge the gap.
Że no nie we wszystkie i nie w każdym momencie, nie we wszystkie przedsięwzięcia inwestorzy prywatni będą tak samo skłonni.
Private investors will not be willing to be present everywhere and will not have the same propensity to invest as compared to the past few years. I'm not talking about stagflation. I'm not saying that there will be capital flight or whatever. No, and we also talked about the Polish zloty depreciating against euro or dollar. These are certain shocks, but they should be transient or they should be temporary. And we actually see that a few weeks into the war, well, these economic parameters have become more stable. We don't have any dramatic developments there. Well, Poland is well anchored in the European Union and NATO, and that actually is a very clear message to the outside world that there is a buffer that helps us mitigate the risks and withstand the shocks. So the whole trend that would increase the overall security. So it's not that we are a minor NATO. We are the fully fledged NATO member that enjoys the same protection as everyone else who's in that alliance. So that should be also an important thing to highlight when we look at the strategies to attract investors. And now, how the government should stimulate more productive, more efficient economy. Well, last week, the Standing Committee of the Council of the Ministers approved the resolution, well, the draft resolution for our productivity strategy by 2030, and this is part of the Sustainable Development Strategy. And this productivity strategy is addressing three challenges. So, energy transition, digitization, and human capital. Human capital meaning that we need to build adequate infrastructure that would facilitate all the processes geared to commercialize academic research. I am an academic myself, so I would like to bring Polish universities on board and include them in the process. And the strategy is looking into it. And finally, by activating various groups, we spoke about women and the influx of Ukrainian refugees in this context. I believe that it should contribute to a more flexible and efficient labor market. And it will show that there is a need to keep learning, because there is some cultural clash that we see here. And we see that as a government, that we need to take adequate measures to unleash the potential of everyone who may contribute to economic growth, to the academic life, etc. And that includes Ukrainian refugees.
Uczenia się przez całe życie.
And the life learning processes. This is something that we should have on the radar too. And I believe that this is the challenge that the EIB also acknowledged in their report. And finally, innovation.
Z jednej strony pobudzana jest przez
Innovation that has been
venture capital, była mowa o inwestycjach
boosted by venture capital.
czy PFR-u właśnie.
We spoke about the contribution of PFR and the BGK
Przez państwo i tak się wszędzie dzieje.
and the endorsement that is expected from the government.
Przesadą, jeżeli się odwołam do klasyka ekonomii.
I think that I may quote
Z noblistów w dziedzinie ekonomii, który
one of the Nobel Prize winners in the economy who said that innovation
pociąga za sobą konieczność jednak też
involves the risk. And therefore, there is a need for the backup of the public sector investors to mitigate the risk. So I think that we are all well prepared to face the challenges, and the instruments that we have and the plan in the form of our productivity strategy 2030 will help effectively improve the productivity and competitiveness of the Polish economy. And we will keep this strong foundation that we have even stronger. Thank you.
Dziękuję panie profesorze.
Thank you, Professor. Well, thank you so much for staying with us until the end, and thank you for being us online and here in the venue. That was the last intervention, and we are closing this conference. Again, many thanks to the organizers, Ministry of Development and Technology, and the European Investment Bank. Everyone who's here at the Stock Exchange, please stay with us for the refreshments. And I would like to thank our online audience and see you again in the future.